Stay with me, because the moment that man refused to stand would cost him everything he ever built. The boardroom on the 47th floor overlooked Manhattan, glass walls stretching from polished marble to a skyline worth billions, and every executive in that room rose the second Ava Carter stepped through the doors, every single one except Ethan Cole, the billionaire CEO whose empire had dominated global markets for over 2 decades, and he didn't look impressed, not at the quiet confidence in her stride, not at the way the room seemed to shift around her presence, not even at the subtle glance exchanged between his own board members as if they already knew something he didn't. Ava stopped at the head of the table, placed a thin leather folder down with a soft, controlled motion, and for a second the only sound was the low hum of the city 47 floors below. Then she looked directly at him, not with anger, not with hesitation, but with something colder, something measured, like a decision already made. 18 years earlier, on a night heavy with rain and silence, that same man had closed the door on a woman who stood alone under a flickering porch light, her hand resting protectively over a life he refused to acknowledge, his final words simple, efficient, and devastating, as if he were ending a business contract instead of a family, and the rain had swallowed everything else, every unanswered question, every promise that dissolved into nothing. Back in the present, Ethan leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, studying Ava like a problem he could solve, like another negotiation he could win. But he didn't know that every second he delayed was tightening something invisible around him, something already set in motion long before she walked into that room. Ava opened the folder, slid a single document across the table, and the closest executive hesitated before picking it up, eyes scanning, posture shifting, and then another screen flickered to life behind her, then another. Lines of data, financial structures, partnerships, numbers that didn't match. The stories Ethan had built his reputation on, and the silence changed. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was recognition. Ava didn't raise her voice, didn't rush, she simply let the evidence breathe, let it settle into the room like a truth that couldn't be ignored, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't loud, but it carried. "You built your empire on control," she said, her tone even, almost calm. "But you forgot something very simple." And Ethan's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to betray the first crack in his certainty. Across the room, one of his oldest partners lowered his gaze. Another leaned back as if creating distance, and for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't the one in control of the narrative. Ava stepped forward, just one step, enough to close the distance without invading it, and her eyes didn't leave his, not for a second. "You walked away from your future," she continued. And something in that sentence didn't sound like accusation, it sounded like fact, like a line written long ago finally being read out loud. Somewhere in that room, a phone buzzed and went unanswered. Somewhere else a breath caught too sharply, and Ethan's hand tightened on the edge of the table, because for the first time, he wasn't sure what came next, and Ava Carter, the woman standing in front of him, already knew exactly how it would end. The document reached Ethan's hands slower than it should have, as if even the paper understood the weight it carried, and when his eyes finally moved across the first line, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that happens before a structure begins to fail. The numbers were precise, the formatting flawless, but it was the connections that mattered, shell companies layered across states, partnerships routed through names that had never appeared in public filings, decisions made quietly that now stood exposed under a light he could not turn off. And across the table Ava Carter did not move, did not rush, she simply watched, as if she had already seen this moment play out 1,000 times. 18 years earlier, in a one-bedroom apartment with a leaking window and a heater that struggled through winter nights, Lily Carter sat at a small kitchen table with a stack of unpaid bills and a newborn asleep in a borrowed crib, the world outside indifferent to her silence, to the way she counted every dollar, to the way she learned to rebuild without asking for help. And she never spoke his name, not once, because to her, survival was not about looking back, it was about moving forward 1 inch at a time. Ava grew up in that quiet resilience. In mornings that started before sunrise and nights that ended with her mother still working under a dim lamp, and she noticed everything, the discipline, the control, the refusal to break, and by the time she was 10 years old, she understood something most people never learn, that power was not given, it was built, carefully, deliberately, piece by piece. Back in the boardroom, a second screen illuminated, then a third, each revealing another layer, contracts that contradicted public statements, timelines that no longer aligned, and the room began to feel smaller, tighter. As if the walls themselves were closing in on the truth, Ethan placed the document down, but his hand did not leave it, his mind already moving, calculating, searching for leverage, for weakness, for anything he could use to regain control, because men like him did not lose. They adjusted, they pivoted, they rewrote the narrative, but this time, the narrative was not his to control. Ava stepped slightly to the side, allowing the full display behind her to come into view. Global markets reacting in real time, numbers shifting, confidence slipping in ways that could not be reversed with a single call or a strategic statement, and still her voice remained calm, almost quiet. "Every system has a foundation," she said, her tone measured, "and every foundation has a flaw." And that was when one of the senior board members cleared his throat, not to speak, but to create space between himself and the man at the center of it all. Years ago, Ava had asked her mother a simple question, sitting at that same small table, her voice curious, not bitter. "Why did he leave?" And Lily had paused, not because she did not know the answer, but because she chose her words carefully. "Because he believed he could walk away without consequences," she said, her voice steady, and Ava had nodded, not fully understanding then, but remembering every word. Now, standing in front of the man who made that decision, Ava let the silence stretch just long enough for it to settle into something irreversible, and when she spoke again, it was not louder, but it was final. "You built everything on the assumption that no one would come back," she said, and for the first time, Ethan Cole realized that this was never a negotiation, it was an ending that had been set in motion the moment he chose to walk away. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured slowly, like something invisible giving way under pressure, and Ethan Cole finally stood, not out of respect, not out of courtesy, but because sitting any longer made him look smaller than he was willing to accept, his voice controlled but sharper now. "What exactly do you want?" he asked, and it was the first time he had asked a question instead of giving an answer, the first sign that the balance had shifted. Ava Carter did not respond. Immediately, she let the question settle into the room, let every person present hear the weight behind it, and then she turned slightly, pressing a small remote in her hand, and the screens changed again, not numbers this time, but timelines, contracts, decisions made over nearly 2 decades, each one connected by a thread that led back to him, and then beyond him, to something he had never considered worth remembering. 18 years earlier, Lily Carter stood in a quiet hospital hallway, holding a newborn wrapped in a thin blanket, the fluorescent lights above humming softly, nurses passing by without noticing the way she paused at the exit, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that every step forward meant leaving behind a life that no longer existed, and when she walked out into the cold morning air, she did not look back, not once. Ava grew up hearing that silence, not as absence, but as intention. And when she turned 16, she found the first piece of truth hidden in a box her mother never locked, a name, a company, a man who had chosen distance over responsibility. And she did not react the way most would expect. There was no anger, no confrontation, only a quiet decision forming beneath the surface. Back in the present, Ethan's eyes moved across the screen, recognizing fragments he thought were buried, patterns he thought were invisible, and then he saw it, a name repeated across multiple acquisitions, small at first, almost insignificant, then growing, expanding, until it intersected directly with his own company, and he looked back at Ava. This time not as a stranger, but as a variable he had underestimated. "You have been inside my company," he said, not asking, stating, and Ava gave a slight nod, not proud, not apologetic, simply acknowledging what was already clear. "Not inside," she corrected gently. "Around it." And the distinction mattered more than anyone in the room wanted to admit. One of the board members shifted in his seat. Another glanced toward the door as if considering leaving, but no one moved, because whatever was happening had gone too far to ignore. Ava stepped forward again, her voice steady. "You built something powerful," she said, and for a brief moment it almost sounded like respect. "But you assumed it would never be challenged." And Ethan felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, not fear, not yet, but recognition that this was no longer about business strategy. It was something deeper, something personal that he could not quantify. Years ago, Ava had stood at the edge of a crowded street, watching a billboard light up with her father's face, his name praised, his success celebrated, and she had asked her mother nothing that night. She simply watched, memorized, and turned away, because she understood that the moment she acted would not be driven by emotion, it would be driven by precision. Now, standing in front of him, she let one final image appear on the screen, a simple document, dated 18 years ago, a signature at the bottom, his signature. Finalizing a decision he had long forgotten, and beneath it, a name he had never taken the time to read. And the room went completely still as Ava's voice cut through the silence, calm and exact. "You never even looked at what you were leaving behind," she said, and this time, there was no mistaking it. This was not just exposure, this was consequence finally catching up to him. The air in the boardroom felt different now, heavier, like every breath carried a truth no one could ignore, and Ethan Cole's eyes did not leave the document on the screen, that single line from 18 years ago repeating in his mind with a clarity that made it impossible to dismiss. Because it was not just a decision, it was a moment he had erased from memory, a moment that had quietly shaped everything that followed. Ava Carter watched him closely, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a calm understanding of exactly where he stood, because she had studied this moment long before it arrived. Every reaction, every possible denial, every attempt to regain control, and she had already moved past them. "This does not prove anything," Ethan said finally, his voice steady but lacking the certainty it once carried, and a few heads in the room turned toward him, not in agreement, but in expectation, waiting to see if he could still command the narrative the way he always had. Ava tilted her head slightly, almost curious, then pressed the remote again, and the screen shifted to something simpler, something quieter, a series of transfers, small amounts at first, then larger, then structured investments that grew over time, each one connected to a trust that had been building quietly for nearly 2 decades, and at the center of it all was a name that now appeared everywhere, undeniable, deliberate. 18 years earlier, Lily Carter sat across from a small local banker who barely looked up from his paperwork, explaining her plan in clear, measured terms, not asking for sympathy, not asking for exceptions, only asking for access, for the ability to build something that no one could take away again. And when he finally looked at her, there was doubt in his expression, but also curiosity, because people who spoke like that did not usually come from nothing. Ava grew up watching those small beginnings expand, watching her mother turn limited resources into opportunities, watching decisions made quietly ripple outward into something far larger than anyone expected, and by the time she reached adulthood, she was no longer following a path, she was creating one. Back in the present, one of the senior executives leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he studied the numbers more carefully, his expression shifting from confusion to realization, because this was not random, this was strategy executed over years, with patience and precision that mirrored the very methods Ethan himself had used to build his empire. "You have been positioning against us," the executive said slowly, almost to himself, and Ava nodded once, acknowledging the truth without dramatizing it. "Not against you," she replied, her voice even. "Towards something you never saw coming." And the distinction landed harder than any accusation could have. Ethan straightened, his mind racing now, connecting pieces, recognizing patterns he had overlooked, and for the first time, he saw her not as an outsider, not as a challenger, but as someone who understood the system as well as he did, perhaps better, years ago. Ava had stood beside her mother at a small desk, reviewing documents that seemed insignificant at the time, her questions simple, her understanding growing with each answer, and Lily had never once told her what to feel, never once pushed her toward anger or revenge. She had only shown her how to build, how to prepare, how to wait. Now, standing in that room, Ava let the final sequence unfold. projections of future control, voting power, leverage that shifted the balance permanently, and the realization spread across the boardroom in silence. Because this was no longer about exposure, it was about ownership. Ethan's hand moved away from the table slowly, as if releasing something he could no longer hold onto, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more measured. "Who are you?" he asked, and it was not a demand this time, it was a question he needed answered. Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her voice calm. "Someone you chose not to know," she said, and in that moment the distance between past and present collapsed completely, leaving only one undeniable truth standing in its place. The room did not move, but something inside it had already shifted beyond repair, and Ethan Cole felt it in the way no one spoke, in the way no one rushed to defend him, because for the first time, silence was not loyalty, it was distance. His eyes stayed on Ava Carter, searching, calculating, trying to place her into a category he understood: competitor, strategist, investor, anything that could be managed, but she did not fit into any of them. And that uncertainty pressed harder than any accusation. "You are asking for control," he said finally, his voice slower now, more deliberate, as if choosing each word carefully might still restore order. But Ava did not answer right away. She let the assumption linger, then she shook her head slightly, not dismissive, just precise. "I am not asking for anything," she said, and the difference landed in the room with a weight no one could ignore. 18 years earlier, Lily Carter sat at that same small kitchen table, her daughter asleep just a few feet away, and she wrote numbers on a sheet of paper. Again and again, adjusting, recalculating, not because she expected immediate success, but because she understood something fundamental, that control was not taken in a single moment. It was built over time through decisions that seemed small until they were not. Ava grew up watching that patience, learning that the most powerful moves were often invisible until they were complete. And by the time she stepped into the world her father had dominated for years, she was not reacting, she was executing a plan that had been in motion long before he realized it existed. Back in the present, one of the legal advisors cleared his throat, his voice careful. "If these positions are accurate, then the voting structure has already changed," he said, and a ripple moved through the boardroom, subtle but undeniable, because that was the moment it stopped being theoretical, stopped being something that could be debated or delayed. Ava turned slightly, acknowledging the statement without emotion. "It has," she confirmed, and the simplicity of that answer carried more finality than any explanation could have. Ethan's posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that he understood what that meant, not just for the company, but for himself, because power in that room had always been tied to control, and control had always been tied to numbers, and now the numbers no longer belonged to him. Years ago, Ava had stood beside her mother in a quiet office, watching as a modest investment closed, her eyes focused, her questions precise, and Lily had looked at her with a calm certainty that did not need to be spoken. Because she knew her daughter was not just learning the system, she was mastering it. Now, standing in front of the man who had once defined success for an entire industry, Ava did not raise her voice, did not claim victory, she simply allowed the reality to settle. "You built something strong," she said, her tone steady. "But you assumed it would always be yours." And Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when a possibility becomes a certainty, when a path forward disappears without warning. Across the table, one of the board members straightened his posture, as if preparing for a new alignment. Another glanced toward Ava with a different kind of attention, not curiosity anymore, but recognition of authority. And the shift was complete, not announced, not voted on, just understood. Ethan looked at her again, longer this time, searching for something that might still give him leverage, but there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to redefine. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something it had not before, not weakness, but acceptance of a truth he could no longer avoid. "This was planned," he said, and Ava gave a single nod, not proud, not apologetic, just honest. "Every step," she replied, and in that moment, the story he had written for his life, for his empire, for his future, no longer belonged to him at all. The shift in power did not come with a vote or a raised voice, it settled into the room like gravity, quiet but absolute, and Ethan Cole felt it in the way no one looked to him for direction anymore, in the way the board members now glanced toward Ava Carter as if waiting for her next move. He remained standing, but the position no longer meant authority, it felt like exposure, like being the only one. Still holding on to something that no longer existed. "What happens now?" he asked, and this time there was no attempt to control the tone, no effort to shape the outcome, just a question that acknowledged what had already changed. Ava did not answer immediately, she turned slightly toward the glass wall, the city stretching out beneath them in perfect order, a skyline built on ambition and risk, and for a moment she simply observed it, as if measuring the scale of what had led to this point. 18 years earlier, Lily Carter had stood at a bus stop just before sunrise, holding her daughter close against the cold, the city already moving around them, people rushing toward jobs, toward lives that continued without pause, and she had made a quiet decision in that moment, not to chase what was lost, but to build something that could not be taken away again, something that would not depend on anyone else's choice. Ava grew up inside that decision, inside a life where nothing was assumed and everything was earned, and she learned early that the strongest position was not the one you inherited, but the one you created without anyone noticing until it was complete. Back in the boardroom, she turned back toward the table, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "No," she said, and paused just long enough for the word to carry weight. "The company continues." And the simplicity of that statement caused a subtle reaction across the room, because it removed any illusion of chaos, any expectation of collapse. This was not destruction, it was transition. One of the senior executives nodded almost instinctively, as if reassured by the clarity, while another began reviewing the projections still displayed on the screen, already shifting focus from what had been lost to what would come next. Ethan watched this unfold in real time, understanding that the company he had built was not ending. It was moving forward without him at the center, and that realization carried more impact than any direct confrontation could have. Years ago, Ava had asked her mother why she never spoke about the past, why she never tried to change what had happened, and Lily had answered with quiet certainty. "Because the past does not decide what we become." And Ava had carried that with her, not as comfort, but as direction. Now, standing in the place her father once controlled completely, she did not raise her voice, did not claim victory, she simply aligned the future with the plan she had already set in motion. "Leadership will be restructured," she continued, her tone precise, "and accountability will match responsibility." And the words were not dramatic, but they were final. Leaving no space for negotiation, Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze moving from the screens to the people around the table, recognizing the shift in their posture, the way they no longer waited for him to speak, and in that moment, he understood something he had never considered before, that power was not just built, it could be replaced. He looked back at Ava, studying her with a clarity that had been missing until now. And for the first time, there was no attempt to challenge her, no attempt to diminish what she had done, only a quiet acknowledgement of the outcome. "You did not come here for revenge," he said, and Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm, almost reflective. "No," she replied. "I came here because you left something unfinished." And the meaning settled into the room with a stillness that no one could interrupt, because it was not just about a company, it was about a decision made long ago that had finally reached its conclusion. No one reached for the door, even though the meeting had already crossed the point where it could be called a meeting, because what was unfolding now was not business, it was resolution, and Ethan Cole remained where he stood, not out of defiance, but because leaving would have meant admitting something he had never faced before, that the world he controlled no longer required him. Ava Carter did not rush the moment. She understood that silence had its own power, that sometimes the most decisive action was allowing the truth to settle without interruption, and as she stood at the head of the table, the weight of 18 years seemed to compress into a single point in time. "You could have told me," Ethan said, and the sentence felt unfamiliar even to him, stripped of authority, stripped of control, reduced to something almost personal, and a few people in the room shifted slightly, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied, that this was no longer about strategy. It was about something he had never accounted for. Ava's expression did not change, but there was a pause, a brief moment where the past and present aligned. And then she responded, her voice calm, steady. There was nothing to tell. And the simplicity of that answer carried more meaning than any explanation could have, because it was not about information, it was about choice. 18 years earlier, Lily Carter had held her daughter in a quiet room, the world outside moving forward without them, and she had made a decision that would define everything that followed, not to chase acknowledgement, not to demand recognition, but to create a life that did not depend on either, and in that choice there was a strength that did not need to be announced, only lived. Ava grew up understanding that absence was not something to fill, it was something to move beyond, and by the time she stood in front of the man who had once defined her origin, she no longer needed anything from him, not validation, not apology, not even explanation. Back in the boardroom, one of the board members quietly closed his tablet. Another adjusted his posture as if preparing for what came next, because the direction of the company had already shifted, even if no one had formally stated it, and Ava's presence at the head of the table was no longer a disruption, it was the new reality. Ethan looked around the room, seeing the change in small details, the way attention moved, the way decisions were now forming without him at the center, and for the first time in years, he was not ahead of the moment, he was behind it. And now, he said, his voice quieter than before, you take everything. And Ava shook her head slightly, not rejecting the statement entirely, but refining it. No, she replied. I continue what was built. And the distinction settled into the room with quiet certainty, because it reframed everything. This was not about taking, it was about evolving. Years ago, Ava had stood beside her mother as they reviewed their first successful expansion, the numbers modest but meaningful, and Lily had looked at her with a calm pride that did not need words, because she knew that her daughter was not just inheriting a plan, she was becoming something greater than the circumstances that created it. Now, standing in a room filled with people who had once answered only to one man, Ava did not claim authority, she simply embodied it, and the shift was undeniable. Ethan's gaze returned to her, not searching anymore, not calculating, but observing, as if seeing her clearly for the first time, and there was a long pause before he spoke again. You never needed me, he said, and it was not a question, it was a realization, and Ava met his eyes without hesitation, her voice steady, almost quiet. No, she said, but you needed to understand that. And in that moment, the distance between who he had been and who he was now became impossible to ignore, because the lesson he had avoided for 18 years had finally reached him, not through force, not through confrontation, but through the undeniable outcome of a choice he could never undo. The room no longer felt like a place where decisions were debated, it felt like a place where outcomes were acknowledged, and Ava Carter stood at the center of it without raising her voice, without claiming victory, because what she had done did not need to be declared, it was already understood. Ethan Cole remained still, his presence no longer defining the space but existing within it, and for the first time, he seemed to see everything without the filter of control, the board members, the shifting alliances, the quiet acceptance that the structure he had built was no longer anchored to him. So this is how it ends, he said, not with resistance, but with a calm that suggested he was finally seeing the full picture, and Ava did not interrupt, she allowed the statement to exist, because endings were not always dramatic, sometimes they were simply recognized. 18 years earlier, Lily Carter had closed a small notebook after recording another set of numbers, another step forward that no one else would ever notice, and she had looked at her daughter sleeping peacefully, understanding that the future was not something that arrived suddenly. It was something that was shaped day by day, choice by choice, without expectation of recognition. Ava grew up inside that quiet discipline, learning that the most powerful transformations did not need an audience, they only needed consistency. And by the time she stepped into the world her father had dominated, she was not there to disrupt it, she was there to complete something that had been building long before anyone else realized. Back in the boardroom, one of the senior executives finally spoke, his voice careful but clear. "We should move forward with the restructuring," he said, and the words were simple, but they marked the final transition, because they did not ask for approval, they assumed it, and several others nodded in agreement, not out of pressure, but out of recognition that the direction was already set. Ava acknowledged the shift with a slight inclination of her head, then stepped back just enough to allow the room to move without her guiding every detail, because control, as she had learned, was not about holding every piece, it was about knowing when the system could sustain itself. Ethan watched this unfold, not with frustration, but with a clarity that had been missing until now. Because he could see the difference between what he had built and what she had become. His empire had been constructed through force of will, through dominance, through the belief that control had to be maintained at all costs. But hers had been built through patience, through understanding, through the ability to let things evolve until they reached a point where no resistance could change the outcome. Years ago, Ava had stood at a window in that small apartment, looking out at a city that felt impossibly distant from the life she knew, and she had not dreamed of belonging to it. She had simply decided that one day she would understand it completely, and that decision had shaped everything that followed. Now, standing in the place where that understanding had fully formed, she did not look triumphant, she looked certain, as if this moment had always been inevitable. Ethan finally moved, not toward the table, not toward the screens, but toward the window, standing beside her for the first time without positioning himself above or ahead, and there was a long silence before he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "You did not take anything from me," he said, and Ava turned slightly, her expression unchanged, her voice calm. "No," she replied. "I showed you what was never yours to begin with." And the words did not echo, they settled, deep and permanent, because they were not meant to challenge him, they were meant to define the truth he could no longer avoid, and in that moment, the story of his rise and fall was no longer a matter of perspective, it was a matter of consequence that had finally reached its conclusion. The city outside continued as it always had, traffic moving in steady lines, lights shifting from green to red to green again, a rhythm that did not pause for anyone, and inside the boardroom, the final moments of something much larger than a company settled into silence. Ava Carter stood near the window, her reflection faint against the glass, not watching the people behind her, not measuring reactions. Because she no longer needed to, everything that mattered had already revealed itself. Ethan Cole remained beside her, but there was a distance now that had nothing to do with space, it was the distance between what he had believed and what he now understood, and for the first time, he did not try to close it. "I spent years building this," he said quietly, not as a defense, not as a justification, but as a statement of fact, and Ava did not dismiss it, she acknowledged it with a slight nod, because effort had never been the question, only the foundation it was built on. 18 years earlier, Lily Carter had finished writing in that small notebook and closed it for the last time, not because the work was done, but because the direction was set, and she looked at her daughter, no longer a child, understanding that the life they had built together was no longer defined by what had been taken from them, but by what they had created without it. Ava grew up carrying that quiet certainty, not as pride, but as clarity, and every decision she made, every move she executed, was guided by a simple principle, that nothing built on disregard could last without consequence. Back in the present, the boardroom began to move again, not with urgency, but with purpose, conversation starting in low voices, plans forming, the future reorganizing itself without needing to be announced, and Ava turned away from the window, not to take control, but to allow the system to continue as it was meant to. Ethan watched her, not with resistance, not with regret, but with a recognition that came too late to change anything, because he could now see the full arc of what had happened, the decision he made years ago, the absence he created, the space that allowed something stronger to grow without him. "What happens to me?" he asked, and there was no fear in the question, only a quiet acceptance of whatever answer would come, and Ava met his gaze, her expression steady, her voice calm. "That depends on what you choose to understand," she said, and the answer was not about position or title, it was about something deeper, something he had avoided for too long. Years ago, Ava had asked her mother if people ever truly changed, and Lily had answered with the same calm certainty she carried through everything. Only when they finally see what they refused to see before. And that answer had stayed with her. Not as hope, but as truth. Now, standing in front of the man who had once defined her beginning, Ava did not offer him a path, she did not offer him redemption, she simply left the possibility open, because some outcomes could not be given, they had to be realized. The boardroom doors opened quietly as people began to step out, the meeting transitioning into something new. Something that no longer needed the weight of what had just ended, and Ava took one final look at the skyline, not as a goal, not as a destination, but as something she now fully understood. Ethan remained where he was, his reflection faint beside hers in the glass, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to argue, only the quiet presence of a truth that had finally reached its conclusion. And as Ava turned and walked away, her steps measured, unhurried, she did not look back, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she had already carried the past as far as it could go, and the future no longer required it, leaving behind a silence that said more than any final word ever could. Because some men do not lose everything in a single moment, they lose it slowly, over years, the second they decide that walking away will never come back to find them.